Adrian held my hand tighter when his grandfather looked down at our joined fingers and told him to let go. Adrian did not move. His grandfather struck the desk so hard that the room went silent. He asked whether Adrian intended to defy the entire Shaw family for a college romance. Adrian looked straight at him and said that no one would need to defy anyone if they stopped trying to decide his life for him. I tried to pull my hand away, but Adrian only held on more firmly. Then his grandfather turned to me and asked whether I understood who I was and what kind of family I was standing in front of. Before I could answer, Adrian stepped in again. He said that this was his choice, that I was his boyfriend, and that no one had the right to interrogate me for a decision he had already made. I had known Adrian for 6 years, loved him for almost 2, and hidden our relationship from nearly everyone around us. That night, the secret finally became impossible to hide. Several months earlier, the black suitcase Adrian Shaw had brought home was still sitting in the middle of the living room when my mother called me over from the staff residence behind the main house. She handed me a folder and a small box of medicine, lowering her voice as if she were afraid someone might hear. Adrian had injured his hand. Mrs. Shaw had asked him several times what happened, but he refused to explain. My mother wanted me to bring the documents upstairs and check whether the wound was serious. I looked at the medicine box and reminded her that the Shaw family had a private doctor. She said she knew, but Adrian had sent the doctor away as soon as he returned. Half a month earlier, Adrian had gone overseas for a university exchange program. He was a second-year student, 1 year above me. During those 2 weeks, we still messaged every day, but Adrian had a terrible habit. He repeated good news 3 times and hid bad news completely. The injury on his hand clearly belonged to the second category. The 3rd floor of the villa was much quieter than the lower floors. I knocked twice and heard nothing. Just as I lifted my hand to knock again, the door opened. Adrian stood in front of me wearing a dark shirt and simple trousers. His hair was still damp, probably because he had just showered. Compared with his usual perfectly arranged appearance, he looked several years younger. His normally distant eyes rested on my face for a few seconds. Then he told me to come in. I said that Mrs. Shaw had asked me to bring the documents upstairs. The door closed behind me. I had not even placed the folder on the desk when Adrian caught my wrist. He looked at the papers, then at the medicine box and asked whether that was all I had brought. I told him I had come upstairs to work and asked what else he expected. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. The distance between us suddenly became too small. I pushed his shoulder away and told him that after half a month apart, the first thing he did was talk nonsense. He told me that since I entered the room I had looked at him 4 times, and 3 of those times I had been staring at his hand. I removed the old bandage. A long cut ran across his palm. I asked what caused it. He said metal. I asked where. He said beside a road. I asked why. Adrian looked at me and said he thought someone had stepped in front of a car. I asked when he had started enjoying heroics. After a short silence, he added that the person looked like me from behind. The hand holding the gauze stopped in midair. I asked whether he knew I was still in the country. I asked whether he also knew I could not suddenly appear thousands of kilometers away. I told him that made his decision even more ridiculous. Adrian lifted his uninjured hand and caught my fingers. He said his mind had simply not reacted in time. It was an ordinary sentence, but something seemed to block the center of my chest. I lowered my head and continued wrapping his hand. I told him that next time he should look carefully before saving someone. He said there would not be a next time. He said that next time he would simply take me everywhere with him. Half a month apart was enough to make familiarity feel both comfortable and strange. Adrian and I had known each other for 6 years, and we had been dating for 1 year and 7 months. Other than a few close friends of Adrian, no one knew. My mother did not know. Mrs. Shaw did not know either. The adults in both families thought we were simply close because we had grown up beside each other. When I was 13, my mother had been hired by the Shaw family to manage the household. My father worked in another province most of the time, so she arranged for me to transfer to school in Rivorton. Mrs. Shaw had joked that Adrian had a difficult personality and asked me to keep an eye on him because we attended the same school. That joke slowly became a habit. Everyone thought I was the person assigned to keep the young heir of the Shaw family under control. No one knew that when Adrian turned 18, he cornered me at the end of a school corridor and told me that if I kept pretending not to understand that he liked me, he would change the way he confessed. I asked how he planned to change it. He kissed me. That was the only time Adrian acted before asking my permission. I ignored him for 3 days afterward. From then on, he learned patience. The new bandage had just been secured when my phone vibrated. My mother had sent a message asking me to come downstairs. I packed the medicine away and said Mrs. Shaw probably wanted to ask about the injury. Adrian stood as well and said he would come with me. I told him that the person Mrs. Shaw wanted to question was me, so his presence would only make things worse. He said I could simply tell her that the owner of the injured hand wanted to confess personally. I warned him that if Mrs. Shaw learned the real reason he was hurt, he would be in trouble. He suddenly caught my shoulder, pulled me closer, and pressed a light kiss to my forehead. Then he told me not to be jealous. Before he could come downstairs with me, the housekeeper called him to his grandfather. I went to the first floor alone. My mother was waiting in a small room beside the kitchen. Mrs. Shaw had already left. A thin file remained on the table. My mother told me that the person Adrian had saved overseas had been found. I was surprised that the Shaw family had investigated him. My mother said Mrs. Shaw was curious because Adrian had almost never involved himself in the problems of strangers. I stared at the last line a little longer than necessary. My mother said he would attend the same university as Adrian and me. The Hayes and Shaw families already knew each other, and Mrs. Shaw thought the coincidence felt like fate. She wanted me to pay attention after school started and see whether Adrian and Ethan spent much time together. I asked whether she wanted me to spy on Adrian. My mother immediately denied it. She said Mrs. Shaw was only worried that Adrian might finally like someone and have no idea how to show it. I nearly choked on the water I had just taken. My mother asked what was wrong. I told her nothing. I placed the cup down and asked what she expected me to do. She said nothing complicated. If I happened to see Adrian and Ethan together, I could simply tell her. Footsteps came from the stairs. Adrian crossed the hall and his gaze landed exactly where I was sitting. My mother immediately called him over. He stopped and told her again that she could simply call him Adrian. My mother had worked for the Shaw family for years, but she still kept a careful boundary between employer and employee. She refused. Adrian said Ryan had bandaged it again for him. My mother looked surprised and asked whether he already knew the name. Adrian said he learned it after the accident. Mrs. Shaw had also told him that Ethan would attend the same university. My mother said it was a remarkable coincidence. When my mother stepped outside to collect something, Adrian came to my side and tapped the photograph with one finger. He asked whether Ethan was handsome. I looked at the photograph, then at Adrian, and said he looked fine. Adrian asked whether he had requested a detailed evaluation. I reminded him that he was the one who asked first. He turned away. I caught his sleeve and told him that Mrs. Shaw had assigned me to observe whether the two of them developed any kind of relationship. Adrian turned back and asked what kind of relationship she expected. I said something like dating. I said that was what Mrs. Shaw appeared to think. I told him I was still considering it. Adrian leaned down until the distance between us disappeared. He said my full name, Ryan Blake, and warned me to try considering it one more time. I could see irritation clearly in his eyes. I slowly said that I was considering whether to tell Mrs. Shaw that he already had a boyfriend. Adrian went silent for 2 seconds. Then he said we should go downstairs and tell her immediately. He reminded me that I was the one who mentioned making our relationship public. His voice lowered. He told me never to use that subject to test him. He had never wanted to hide me. I knew that. The reason our relationship remained secret had never been Adrian. It was me. My mother worked in his family home. My family had lived comfortably for years because of that job. Between Adrian and me there was not only affection, but a network of family, money, work, expectations, and social differences. I did not want one impulsive decision, made before I could take responsibility for my own future, to drag both families into a conflict. Adrian understood, so he agreed to wait. He simply never liked waiting. I heard my mother returning outside. Adrian stepped back. Before leaving, he leaned near my ear and said that if the new student came looking for him, I would have to deal with it. I asked why that should be my responsibility. He said I was the one assigned to observe him. I told him Mrs. Shaw had asked me to observe him, not manage his admirers. Adrian said that if I was going to watch, I should watch carefully. In the square outside the main hall, someone called me from behind. I stopped. The young man from the photograph stood a few meters away, wearing a light shirt and a new student identification card. In person, Ethan looked even younger. He looked at me for several seconds and asked whether I was Ryan Blake. His eyes brightened. He said that meant I probably knew Adrian Shaw. I told him I knew Adrian quite well. Adrian had been speaking to someone beside him. When he saw Ethan, he only paused slightly. Ethan smiled brightly and asked whether Adrian remembered him. Adrian looked at me first. Only then did he say that he remembered. Ethan said he had been afraid Adrian would forget. Adrian answered that his memory was not that bad. A message from Adrian appeared. He asked whether I was enjoying the show. I replied that his mother had given me an assignment. His next message arrived immediately. He said we would settle the account that night. I put my phone away. Ethan was still waiting for an answer. Adrian said there was no need for thanks because the matter was over. Ethan asked whether they could at least be friends. Adrian said he did not need more friends. Adrian looked at me and said he knew. I told him that if he knew, he should move. The friends standing beside him all became silent. Ethan stared at us too. Adrian did not argue. He simply followed me. After a few steps, he asked where I was sitting. I said the foreign languages section was on the left. I heard every word. Adrian heard them too. He leaned slightly toward me and said I had destroyed his reputation. I told him he had destroyed it himself. He murmured that he was only listening to his boyfriend. I stepped on the front of his shoe and told him to be quiet. At the time, I did not know how much trouble that look would eventually bring. I only knew that Adrian secretly took my hand beneath the folder I was carrying. In the middle of a crowded square, he held it for only a few seconds before letting go. It was enough to make one thing clear. Adrian had no intention of hiding quietly forever. Within a week, Ethan Hayes became well known around campus. It was not because he deliberately sought attention. The Hayes family name was enough to make people curious, and Ethan was handsome, friendly, and easy to talk to. He was the opposite of Adrian. Ethan could walk into a room and speak to strangers within minutes. Adrian could sit silently and make everyone around him lower their voices. No one needed to tell me. I could see it. He appeared near Adrian often. Some days he brought class notes and asked questions. Some days he used the old accident as an excuse to thank him again. On other days he needed no excuse at all. What surprised me was that Adrian never lost his temper with him. He did not encourage Ethan, but he also did not humiliate him. I asked about it one evening when Adrian and I were eating at the apartment he owned near university. I asked when he had become so mature. Adrian looked up from the food container and asked what I meant. I mentioned Ethan, and said the boy had followed him around for almost half a month and Adrian still had not driven him away. I accepted the chopsticks he handed me and said Mrs. Shaw would probably be delighted to hear that. Adrian put the lid down harder than necessary and said I was starting again. I said I was only reporting the situation. I said that the relationship was developing steadily. Then he asked why it was so difficult for me to be jealous even once. I genuinely did not understand why he was so obsessed with that. I asked what jealousy would accomplish. I said the absence of jealousy did not mean the absence of care. Adrian had made his position clear, so there was no reason for me to feel threatened. He stared at me for a long time, then asked whether I trusted him that much. I told him there would be no point dating him if I did not. The irritation on his face softened immediately, but only for a few seconds. Then he looked unhappy again. He said that when other people had admirers chasing their boyfriends, they at least acted possessive. I asked whether he wanted me to put a sign on his forehead. His eyes dropped to my neck and he said the forehead was not necessary. I kicked him under the table and told him to eat. He caught my ankle through the fabric of my trousers. I accused him of doing something even though he had not moved. I told him his eyes had already done enough. Then he said I should stay at the apartment that night. I reminded him that I had an early class the next morning. He said the apartment was 10 minutes from campus. Sure enough, close to 11 at night, just as I prepared to call a car back to the dormitory, heavy rain began outside. Adrian stood beside the window with a perfectly calm expression and said it was unsafe. I said the drainage in that area was good. I told him again that cars had roofs. Finally he turned and asked whether I truly intended to leave. I reminded him that I was 19 years old. I told him to move away from the door. I looked at him. He looked back and said it had nothing to do with him. I told him he looked far too pleased. I warned him that if he had somehow told every driver nearby not to accept my request, he was insane. He said he was not insane enough to do that. I checked 2 more applications. No one accepted. The rain outside was pouring so hard that I finally gave up. I asked who it belonged to and when he had bought it. He said he had prepared it in advance. I reminded him that I had never said I would stay there often. I told him that was not foresight, it was a condition that needed treatment. Nothing happened that night other than 2 people sharing a bed. Adrian held me from behind. His familiar scent made the entire room feel quiet. Between the 2 weeks we had spent apart and the heavy class schedule after the semester began, we had barely had time alone. He told me not to use Ethan to tease him anymore. I asked whether it truly bothered him that much. He said he did not like being paired with someone else. He already had a boyfriend. I stayed silent for a moment before saying that I knew. He answered that I knew, but everyone else did not. I did not answer. Adrian did not push me. He simply pulled the blanket higher around me. That weekend, Adrian and a group of his friends met at a private club. I had not planned to go, but Kevin Cole called 3 times. On the final call, he said that if I did not come, Adrian would probably refuse to show up too. The private room on the 2nd floor was almost as large as an apartment. Around 10 people were there, all friends from our high school years. They were also among the very few people who knew Adrian and I were together. As soon as I entered, Kevin threw me a can of soda and announced that the only person capable of controlling Adrian Shaw had finally arrived. I caught the can and told him to stop exaggerating. Adrian sat at the far end of the sofa with his long legs stretched comfortably in front of him. The seat beside him was empty. I sat there. He immediately took the can from my hand, opened it and returned it to me. Kevin watched the entire exchange and shook his head. He said he truly did not understand why we kept the relationship secret when everyone in that room already knew. I said my family did not know, and neither did Adrian. Another friend said Mrs. Shaw might figure it out by herself soon. The friend said Mrs. Shaw had been asking questions about Ethan Hayes. Apparently Mrs. Shaw had asked what Ethan was like, whether he was dating anyone, and whether he had shown interest in anyone at university. The entire room went silent for 1 beat. Then everyone looked at Adrian. I said his mother seemed very invested in his romantic future. Adrian pointed out that his actual boyfriend was sitting beside him. Kevin laughed so hard he almost spilled his drink. He warned me that one day the Shaw family might send engagement gifts to the Hayes family before anyone realized what had happened. About half an hour later, I received an urgent message from the head of the University Media Club. Something needed to be handled on campus. I stood and told everyone to keep playing because I had to leave. Adrian immediately picked up his coat and said he would take me back. Kevin called after us that no one should interfere because Adrian always listened to his boyfriend. Once we were outside, I told Adrian that following me out in the middle of a gathering only made people more suspicious. He asked whether friends taking each other home was really strange. I said friends did not normally abandon a party the moment one of them needed to leave. Adrian opened the passenger door and said friends like us apparently did. I watched Adrian let it ring 4 times. Then I asked why he was not answering. He said he would answer if I wanted him to. Ethan's voice came through the speakers. He asked whether he was disturbing Adrian. Ethan said he was in the library and had a statistics problem he did not understand. Several people had told him Adrian had received one of the highest scores in the course, so he wanted to ask for help. Adrian told him to send it to the teaching assistant. Adrian glanced at me and said he was taking his boyfriend back to campus. I turned toward him. He kept his eyes on the road as if he had said nothing unusual. Then Ethan asked whether Adrian already had a boyfriend. Ethan asked whether he knew him. Ethan recognized my voice and asked whether Ryan was there too. Ethan quickly said he would not bother us anymore and wished us a safe drive. I looked at Adrian and told him he had done that deliberately. I said he could have stopped after saying he was busy. I asked about the part where he said Ethan probably knew his boyfriend. Adrian finally allowed the corner of his mouth to lift. He said Ethan did know me, so the answer was accurate. If Ethan guessed the rest, that would be even better. He said he did not want anyone to pursue him because they believed he was single. I could ask him not to point directly at me, and he had respected that request for a long time. But I could not ask him to behave as if he had never loved anyone at all. The light turned green. Adrian looked forward again and drove. Adrian did not look at me. He said he did not need an apology. He said that one day he wanted me to introduce him to someone as my boyfriend. Anyone would do. Adrian turned toward me at once and asked whether I meant it. I opened the door. Before I could step out, Adrian caught my hand, pulled me toward him, and pressed a quick kiss to the corner of my mouth. He reminded me that I had made a promise and told me not to forget it. A few steps after I left the car, my phone received a message from my mother. She asked me to come home that weekend. Mrs. Shaw wanted to ask me about Adrian and Ethan. Mrs. Shaw's birthday celebration that year was larger than usual. Guests arrived from the afternoon until late at night. My mother was busy for 2 straight days. Several temporary workers called in sick, so the service staff ended up short-handed. I volunteered to help with the logistics area. I asked Adrian why he had come downstairs. He removed one cuff link and said he was looking for me. I told him there were nearly 100 guests upstairs waiting to greet him. I asked where his grandfather was. He said his grandfather was playing chess and his mother was receiving guests. Then he said he would help his boyfriend. The answer was far too natural. I looked down the corridor and was relieved that no one was nearby. I told him not to say that there. I also told him not to touch the boxes. Adrian asked why. He reminded me that he was 20 years old and perfectly capable of moving a cardboard box. Before I could stop him, he bent down and lifted one. He was wearing a white dress shirt, black tailored trousers, and expensive shoes made for formal events. He looked like someone about to enter a board meeting, yet he was carrying wine boxes behind me into a storage room. The image was so absurd that I almost refused to look. I told him to put the box down. I told him the shelf on the left. He placed it exactly where I indicated and asked what came next. He said I was lying. He took the list from my hand and pointed out that 6 items remained. When my mother returned from the front hall, Adrian had just slipped away through the back corridor. She looked at the rearranged boxes and asked who had helped me. She said she had just called all of them to the main hall. I calmly said one must have come back. He asked who. I answered, my boyfriend. The final guests left close to 11. My mother stayed with the housekeeper to check the main hall. I returned to the staff residence behind the villa. The room my mother and I had used for years was on the first floor. It was not large, but it was comfortable enough. Since beginning university, I lived in the dormitory and only came home on some weekends. My door had been closed for less than 5 minutes when someone knocked. I assumed it was my mother. Instead, Adrian stood outside. His tie was gone and his jacket rested over one arm. He said that question should be directed at me. He stepped inside and admitted that he had drunk a little. I told him he looked like he had a headache and should return to his room. I told him that coming downstairs to act spoiled would not work on me. Even so, he sat naturally in the chair beside my small table. The entire room was smaller than the dressing room beside his bedroom upstairs. When I first moved into the Shaw estate, I had been very aware of that difference. After years, I no longer felt it sharply. Adrian seemed not to notice it at all. He had been in that room more times than I could count. He offered the hand that had been injured. I said not that one. I wanted to check whether he had a fever. I poured warm water and told him to finish it. I said that if his head still hurt, Sleep would probably help. He caught the hem of my shirt and told me to sit with him for a while. I sat opposite him and told him that Mrs. Shaw had asked my mother about Ethan again that day. His eyes opened fully and he asked whether I absolutely had to bring Ethan up. I said that the two of them had made no romantic progress at all. Mrs. Shaw had asked why. I told her Adrian already liked someone. Adrian sat upright and asked whether I had really said that. He asked whether his mother had asked who the person was. I admitted that I told her I did not know. He said he had thought I was finally keeping my promise. I reminded him that I had promised to introduce him to someone. I had never said that person would be his mother. I said he had misunderstood by himself. I told him not to be angry. He said he was not angry with me. Those words bothered me more than anger would have. If he became angry, I could argue back. Instead, he simply accepted the situation. I sat quietly for a few seconds, then reached out and told him to come closer. He stood. I caught his shirt collar and kissed him. It was only a light touch, enough to make him freeze. I told him I would say it when the time was right. I repeated that I really would. Adrian looked at me for a long time. Then he wrapped his arms around me, pulling my whole body against his chest. He told me not to make him wait too long. He buried his face beside my shoulder. He did nothing beyond that. He simply held me. After a long time, Adrian finally released me. He asked whether I believed he was capable of walking back upstairs. I said he had only drunk 2 glasses. Adrian opened the door. Before leaving, he told me to eat breakfast with him the next morning. I said I had class. He said he would drive me at 7. After he left, I locked the door and noticed that the glass he had used still sat on my table. It was the most ordinary object in the room, yet for some reason it stood out. My mother knocked a little after 6 the next morning. I had just finished dressing. She looked at me carefully and asked whether I had slept late. Then she asked why my neck was red. I immediately remembered how tightly Adrian had held me and how the collar of my shirt had rubbed against my skin. I said there were still mosquitoes around even in that season. My mother looked for another 2 seconds. Then she asked directly whether I was dating someone. She pulled out a chair and said she was not going to forbid anything. I was 19, but if the relationship was serious, she at least wanted to know something about the person. I leaned against the table and said he attended the same university. She asked whether the person was male or female. My mother only nodded. My family had never treated the fact that I liked men as a problem. I had told my parents when I was 16. My father needed a few days to adjust, but he never objected. My mother had always been calmer. I said 1 year older. She asked about his family. My mother immediately noticed that the question was difficult. Then she smiled and said that one day I should bring him to meet my parents. I had barely relaxed when she added that anyone would be fine as long as it was not Adrian Shaw. She said she was only joking, but then became more serious. Someone like Adrian would probably face very complicated family expectations around marriage. She said I could love anyone I wanted, but she hoped I would not choose someone who made life unnecessarily exhausting. A message from Adrian arrived at exactly that moment. He asked whether I was coming downstairs. I stared at the screen for a long time, then answered that I was on my way. His car was parked beneath the trees outside the villa. Adrian leaned against the door. When I approached, he handed me a cup of coffee made without sugar. He asked why I was staring at him. He said there was obviously a reason. I finally told him my mother knew I was dating someone. Adrian immediately stood straighter and asked whether she knew it was him. He asked whether I planned to tell her. I remembered my mother's words about not choosing a person who would make my life too tiring, then looked at Adrian. He did not ask again. He simply opened the car door for me. Before I sat down, he said that whatever day I chose, he would be there. It was a simple sentence. He did not promise to fight anyone or change the world. He only promised to show up. Ethan sat in front of the table and greeted me. I told him to answer normally. To be fair, he was genuinely capable. His writing was strong, he thought quickly, and he had a good eye for photographs. Nathan was pleased after only a few questions. I looked at him. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke. Nathan was the most surprised. He asked why Adrian Shaw had suddenly developed an interest in the media club. Adrian said he was waiting for someone. Adrian pulled a chair to the back of the room and told us to continue working. Nathan looked at me. I pretended not to notice. Ethan asked whether Adrian had known he was applying to the club. Ethan did not seem bothered. He said that from then on he and Ryan would belong to the same club. Adrian glanced at me and said good. The interviews ended around 6. Ethan was accepted. Nathan suggested everyone go out for dinner. Adrian was not part of the club, but somehow he was pulled along anyway. On the way, I deliberately asked whether he was not going home. He said he was eating dinner. Nathan heard us and turned around, loudly declaring that he had invited Adrian too. Then he joked that having Adrian Shaw there might even mean someone else would pay. Adrian told him everyone could pay for themselves. Dinner lasted more than 2 hours. I drank very little. Nathan sat beside me and did not pressure me. Near the end, he suddenly asked whether I currently had a boyfriend. The table was noisy, so not many people heard. Nathan looked directly at me, and the meaning in his eyes was clear enough that I understood immediately. He looked surprised and asked whether I was serious. Nathan stayed quiet for a few seconds, then smiled and said he had arrived too late. He said there was nothing to apologize for. Adrian stood beside the car outside. As soon as he saw me, he said Nathan liked me. I asked whether he had overheard the conversation. Adrian said he could recognize the way a man looked at his boyfriend. I walked toward the car and told him I had already refused Nathan. He asked exactly what Nathan had said. I told him nothing dramatic had happened. I had simply said I already had a boyfriend. He asked whether I had actually said it myself. He asked whether I had said it to Nathan. I told him the promise from before could now be considered fulfilled. Adrian said I had not introduced him. I said Nathan had not asked for a name. If he asked later, I would tell him. Adrian said he understood. His mood was visibly better. He asked whether he could have one kiss because I had made him happy. I told him to enjoy his happiness without expecting a reward. He said the car had cameras too. I said that made the idea even worse. Adrian laughed quietly and finally sat straight. At that moment, someone came out of the restaurant. Ethan saw our car and walked over. He said he had planned to call a ride, but no drivers were available. Ethan asked whether we were returning to campus and whether he could come with us. Adrian looked at me. I knew he was waiting for my opinion. He sat in the back. During the drive, he talked mostly about the media club. Adrian answered only when necessary. When we reached the first-year dormitory, Ethan opened the door but paused before leaving. He reminded Adrian that he had said he already had a boyfriend. Then he asked whether that person treated Adrian well. Adrian looked at me too, then answered that his boyfriend treated him very well. Ethan was silent for a moment. Then he said he understood. Ethan said nothing important. He thanked us for the ride and left. I said Ethan looked as if he was finally preparing to give up. Adrian said he did not know and did not particularly care. The person he cared about had just received a confession from someone else. I asked how long he intended to keep mentioning Nathan. Adrian asked whether today was too long. Then he asked whether tomorrow would be better. I told him he would probably invent another reason by then. When I first met Julian, I only knew his surname. That day I finally realized he was related to Ethan. The lesson ended. Julian had just returned home. He wore a gray shirt and was tall. His face resembled Ethan's slightly, but he looked much more mature. I said his grammar had become stronger, but his listening still needed practice. I would continue reminding him. We spoke for a few minutes. When I reached the gate, a familiar car was parked across the road. I checked the time. Adrian had arrived 10 minutes early. Julian noticed the car as well and asked whether that was my friend. I said yes, he had come to pick me up. I said goodbye and crossed the road. Adrian unlocked the door and immediately asked who the man had been. He asked whether I was tutoring Julian's nephew. He asked why he had never known. I said because he had never asked. Then he asked whether I knew Julian was 27 and single. I turned to stare at him and asked whether he had already investigated the man. Adrian drove onto the road and said he had only learned a few basic things. I studied the side of his face and asked whether he was jealous. I said Julian was only the guardian of a student I tutored. I asked how he could possibly know. He said men understood the way other men looked. I reminded him that I was also a man, and I had not seen anything unusual. He said that was because I was the person being looked at. He said it was not excessive yet. I decided not to ask what excessive would look like. At the next intersection, Adrian calmly announced that the following week he would drive me to tutoring. He claimed it was convenient. Adrian was silent for a while. Then he told me to at least remember that I already had a boyfriend, because he had never forgotten even for a single day. Only 3 weeks later, Julian Hayes told me directly that he wanted to pursue me, and the person who learned about it before Adrian was Mrs. Shaw. There was no indirect hint and no attempt to test my reaction. The tutoring session ended early that day. Julian invited me to have tea in the living room and said he wanted to make something clear before he accidentally made me uncomfortable. I could already guess where the conversation was going, so I told him to speak freely. He placed his cup down and said he had developed feelings for me. If I was single, he wanted to pursue me seriously. I told him I already had a boyfriend. Julian looked surprised and asked whether the person was from my university. I said yes and added that the relationship was stable. Very stable. He nodded after a short pause and said he understood. Julian said there was no need. Feelings had to respect boundaries. Adrian did not come to pick me up that week because he had gone on a 3-day business trip with his father. I messaged him immediately and explained what happened. He read the message within seconds, then started a video call. His face appeared on the screen, expression colder than usual. He asked me to repeat Julian's exact words. He said he wanted to hear me say it. Adrian asked whether I had immediately said I had a boyfriend. He asked whether I had said the relationship was stable. He asked whether Julian had given up. I asked whether he had called only to interrogate me. He said he also wanted to see my face. I reminded him that he had only been gone for 3 days. Adrian said 3 days were still 3 days. A door opened behind him. His assistant said something that I could not hear because Adrian covered the microphone. When he returned, he said he would come back the following evening instead of the day after. I told him not to change his schedule because of this. He said he was not changing it. I stared at him until he changed the subject and asked whether I had eaten dinner. Then he asked who I ate with. I told him that was the normal thing to do. He said it might be normal to me, but it was not insignificant to him. I told him to enjoy being happy. A person away on business could apparently improve his entire mood because his boyfriend rejected someone else. I did not know whether to laugh or worry. The day Adrian returned, my mother asked me to come to the Shaw estate. It was not because Adrian wanted to see me. Mrs. Shaw wanted a conversation. Only 3 people were in the East Tea Room: Mrs. Shaw, my mother, and me. A box of pastries sat on the table. I recognized the brand from Julian's home. Mrs. Shaw told me that she had heard Julian Hayes was interested in me. I looked at my mother. She clearly had only just learned about it as well. I said Julian had told me directly. Mrs. Shaw asked what I thought. My mother explained that I had already told her I was dating someone. Mrs. Shaw smiled and said young people should make their own decisions. She only thought Julian was a very good choice. His family background was excellent, he was mature, and the Hayes family did not care much about the social background of a future partner. I told her I understood, but that my current boyfriend was also very good. He was close to my age, 1 year older. Mrs. Shaw laughed and said we were both too young. My mother said she had also told us to take things slowly. Mrs. Shaw turned toward her and said that if Ryan and his current boyfriend did not work out in the future, the Hayes family might genuinely be worth considering. Julian was not someone who became interested in people easily. My mother walked ahead. I went toward him and asked when he had returned. He said he had come straight from the airport and wanted to see me first. I told him his mother had also heard about it because someone from the Hayes family had mentioned it. He asked whether his mother had tried to persuade me to accept Julian. I said she had only said I could consider him if I became single one day. I said I told her I already had a boyfriend. He asked whether she had asked who. Adrian gave a short, humorless smile. He said his mother had never even considered the possibility that the boyfriend could be him. I could not argue with that because it was true. He stepped past me and said he was going to tell her. I reminded him that he had just returned from a flight and was already angry. That made it the worst possible moment. Adrian turned back and said his mother was recommending another man to his boyfriend because she did not know the truth. He needed to tell her. I said not now. He asked whether I had ever chosen a specific day at all. He pulled his hand away and told me to return to university because he still had things to do. I reminded him that a minute earlier he had said he wanted to see me. He said he had already seen me. I stood outside the tea room alone. For the first time in more than a year together, I felt that the distance between us was not created by family background. It was created by my own hesitation. Adrian never stayed angry for long. That night he still messaged to ask whether I had returned to the dormitory. The next morning he still sent breakfast. He did not mention going public again. That weekend, our friends invited us to a racing event. I did not like the sound of engines, but I went because Adrian had loved cars since childhood. 2 years earlier, he had driven on a track himself. I watched once and could not sleep that night. After that, he stopped racing and only watched. The private viewing room was high above the track. I went to get water and heard voices inside before I returned. Someone mentioned Ethan Hayes and said he was still following Adrian around. Another person said the Hayes family also seemed interested in a possible match, and that the two families would be perfectly suited. Someone else agreed. Ethan was bright, friendly, and from the right background. Another voice said Adrian showed no interest now, but that could change. They were only 20. Then someone laughed and said Ryan Blake and Adrian Shaw had been close for years without becoming a couple, which proved there was nothing romantic between them. If two people had looked at each other that long and felt something, surely they could not have resisted forever. Footsteps approached from behind. Adrian stopped beside me. He did not enter either. I opened the door. The conversation inside died instantly. The people who had been speaking looked embarrassed. Adrian said he would drive later. He said he was taking Ryan somewhere. I lightly kicked his shoe under the table. He did not react. When it ended, he drove me to my tutoring session. I asked whether he was angry that everyone kept pairing him with Ethan. He said he was used to it. If I was not jealous, he did not see why he should become angry. I turned toward him and asked whether he was still angry with me. He said he truly was not. He kept his eyes on the road and said he assumed I had my reasons. I told him I did not want him to fight his family for me while we were both still too young. I said I also did not want my mother to lose her job. He said he knew everything. That was why he had never forced me. When we reached the tutoring house, Julian was coming out through the gate. Adrian saw him and Julian recognized Adrian as well. The two men stood several meters apart. I suddenly had a very bad feeling. Adrian returned the greeting. Julian said he had brought Ryan there. Julian looked at me and offered to have his driver take me home after the lesson, so Adrian would not need to make another trip. Adrian immediately said that was unnecessary. He was busy, but never too busy to pick someone up. Julian's eyes stayed on us for 1 second, then 2. I thought he understood something, but he did not say it. He only smiled faintly and said he would not compete. Adrian watched him walk away, then asked what he meant by not competing. I reminded him that I had already rejected Julian. He said he did not like the way Julian looked at me. I opened the car door and told Adrian that was his own problem. He called after me and reminded me he would return at 9. Neither of us knew that someone was sitting in another vehicle near the gate. For the first time, he saw the way Adrian looked at me when there were not many people around. It was not the way a man looked at an ordinary friend. Ethan did not ask immediately. He started observing. During media club meetings, I caught him watching me several times. There was no hostility in his eyes. He simply looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle. Nathan did not dare publish anything immediately. Neither did I. One letter was not evidence. Ethan reacted the strongest. He said we at least had to investigate. I agreed. We could investigate, but nothing would be published before verification. Ethan looked at me and said he would work with me. We began with a list of the former students' classmates. The investigation lasted for days. On some nights, we remained in the club room past 10. I messaged Adrian and told him not to come pick me up. The first time he opened the door and saw Ethan sitting opposite me, he paused for exactly 1 beat. Then he stepped back out. 15 minutes later, 2 meals were delivered. Ethan looked at the bags and asked whether Adrian had ordered them. I said probably. He had not entered because he did not want to interrupt. I opened the food and told him to eat. He picked up his chopsticks but did not start immediately. Instead, he asked what my boyfriend was like. I looked at him and asked why he wanted to know. I told him my boyfriend was troublesome. I continued. He was jealous, difficult, and sometimes stubborn. It did not sound very flattering, but I liked him. Ethan laughed and said he must have good points too. I thought about it. I did not want to turn Adrian into a list of qualities on a report. Finally, I said that when I was beside him, I never had to wonder whether I was loved. After a while, he asked how long I had known that person. I said I thought he did. He looked at me. I did not explain further. I simply told him to eat before the food became cold. The investigation continued for almost 2 weeks. Eventually, we found the former student in a city more than 3 hours away by car. I planned to take the train. When Adrian learned about it, he immediately said he would drive. I said yes. Ethan would stay behind to gather statements. He said he could miss 1 lesson because he had already studied that section. The next morning, Adrian drove for 3.5 hours with almost no break. When we arrived, he did not come upstairs with me. He parked below the building. He did not ask what I was investigating. When I pointed that out, he said if I wanted to tell him, I already would have. He was not going to force information out of me. I asked whether he was truly not curious about the club work that had kept me out so late for 2 weeks. Adrian opened his laptop and said he had his own work to finish. I should call when I was done. The conversation was more difficult than expected. The former student needed a long time before he agreed to show me evidence. Almost 4 hours passed before I returned downstairs. Adrian was still in the car. His laptop was closed. 2 empty coffee cups sat nearby. The moment he saw me, he opened the door and asked whether everything was all right. I said I had found what I needed. I asked whether he had stayed in the car the entire time. I sat in the passenger seat. Adrian handed me water and told me to drink, then sleep. He would drive us back. I reminded him he had already driven all day. As we left the city, the sky darkened. My phone received a message from Ethan. He had found 2 more people willing to confirm parts of the story. Adrian glanced at the name and said Ethan and I had become closer. Then he said Ethan looked at me differently now. I looked at him and asked how many times he had even seen Ethan recently. I told him Ethan did not like me in that way. Adrian said he did not mean romantic interest. Ethan looked like someone who knew a secret. Adrian explained that the last time he came to the club room, Ethan had looked between the 2 of us like someone who had already understood something. I thought about it, then said Ethan was not the kind of person who spread private information. Adrian said that was enough for him. I asked whether he was not worried about Ethan being hurt. Adrian looked straight ahead and said he had rejected Ethan from the beginning. The article was completed 3 days later. Before we published anything, the university received the evidence file. The lecturer involved was suspended pending investigation. On the final night of editing, Ethan sat opposite me. It was almost midnight when he suddenly asked whether the article still contained any errors. Then he said he had decided not to like Adrian anymore. I asked whether he really needed to report that decision to me. Ethan rested his elbows on the table and said because he thought I was the person he needed to tell. I looked at him and said he already knew. He said no one had told him, but it was not difficult to guess. Ethan laughed with a little embarrassment. He said that at first he thought Adrian treated me well, because we had known each other for years. Then he realized normal friends did not behave that way. I could not stop the corner of my mouth from lifting. Ethan pointed at me and said that was another clue. I smiled normally, but whenever Adrian was mentioned, something about my expression changed. Then he leaned back and said he had lost very clearly. I told him there had never been a competition. Ethan said there had been from the perspective of the person pursuing someone. I asked what he planned to do now. Then he told me not to worry. He would not tell anyone. Ethan asked why I did not need an explanation. I told him he was not the type who enjoyed spreading other people's private lives. He stayed quiet for a few seconds, then smiled and said he finally understood why Adrian liked me. I told him not to start liking me too. He laughed and said I had nothing to worry about. Ethan stood and told him we were finished. He picked up his backpack and said his driver was waiting downstairs. Ethan left before he could ask anything. Adrian walked toward me and asked what Ethan had said. I told him Ethan said he no longer liked him. Adrian asked why Ethan had wished him good luck. I said maybe because Ethan had realized loving me was difficult. Adrian stared at me and asked whether I had told him. I said Ethan figured it out himself. I added that Ethan was actually a good person. Adrian asked whether I had really just praised the person who used to pursue him. I said Ethan had helped me a lot with the investigation. Adrian asked what he had to do to receive the same praise. I picked up my coat and told him we should go home. I looked at the man standing in front of the desk with a completely serious expression and told him that he was very good too. Specifically, he was the most troublesome person I knew. Adrian caught my wrist and said my full name. I pulled my coat away from the chair and headed for the door. He said I had not finished answering. If outsiders looked carefully enough, our secret had never been hidden very well. My father and younger brother came to Rivorton at the beginning of winter break. It had been years since all 4 members of my family spent more than a day together, so my mother took 2 days off. A restaurant had been reserved a week in advance. I did not know Adrian had made the reservation until I saw the name of the private room. I messaged him and asked whether he had booked it. His reply came immediately. My father had not visited Rivorton for years, so Adrian wanted us to eat somewhere good. I told him I could pay for my own family dinner. A minute later, another message arrived. He said the bill was already paid. I called him directly and asked whether he understood the meaning of the words "I can pay for myself." I told him that next time he could pay for his own family and stop interfering in mine. His voice softened when he said my name. He said he had only reserved 1 dinner. I stopped arguing. Adrian always found ways to help without making it feel like charity. He said if I wanted to thank him, I could meet him that night. I refused immediately because I was spending the evening with my family. He complained that I had rejected him too quickly, then said he understood. My father had barely crossed the lobby when he noticed a group coming down from the elevator. Adrian stood in the middle wearing a dark suit. He looked nothing like a student. An older man beside my father quietly asked the manager who the young man was. The manager answered that he belonged to the Shaw family. My mother recognized him immediately and called out. Adrian stopped. The people with him stopped too. He said something to them and then walked over. My mother greeted him with her usual careful politeness and commented on the coincidence. Adrian said he had a meeting upstairs. My father looked at him. They had met briefly years earlier, but I doubted my father remembered. My mother introduced Adrian as the son of the family she worked for. My father understood immediately and greeted him. My father gave his name Michael Blake. After Adrian left, my brother leaned close to me and said Adrian was extremely handsome. He asked whether I knew Adrian well. My mother added that we attended the same university. My brother immediately asked whether my boyfriend was as handsome as Adrian. My father looked directly at me and asked whether I truly had a boyfriend. My mother told him not to pretend it was completely new information because she had already told him I was dating someone. My father said she had never said the person was male. My mother reminded him that he had known for years that I liked men. My father said knowing that and hearing that I had a boyfriend were different things. He refused. He asked where my boyfriend was. He asked whether the person went to my university. I said 1 year older than me. My father coughed and told Leo to let me eat. A message from Adrian told me to step outside for a moment. I looked at it and did not reply. A second message appeared. He said he was waiting in the east corridor. I stood and said I needed to take a call. Leo immediately became suspicious and asked whether my boyfriend was calling. I asked whether he had been drinking. I asked why his face looked flushed. He said the private room was warm. He studied me for several seconds and said my father had asked about my boyfriend. He asked what I had told them. I said I had not given a name yet. I already knew what question he wanted to ask, but this time he did not. He only told me to go back inside so my family would not wait. He asked where. I said to meet my parents. Adrian stared at me for a long time and asked whether I was certain. I said I was not completely certain, but I no longer wanted to hide. The moment I finished speaking, he pulled me into an embrace. I pushed him at once and reminded him we were in a public corridor. He released me immediately, but his eyes were so bright he could not hide what he felt. He asked me to wait 5 minutes. He said he needed to tell the people upstairs that he was leaving. I told him there was no need to rush. Adrian said he was afraid I would change my mind. A few steps before we reached the private room, Adrian suddenly asked whether my father hit people. I looked at him and asked whether he was afraid. He said he was preparing. I told him my father would not hit him, but he might ask a lot of questions. All 4 people inside looked at us. Leo reacted first and said Adrian's name in surprise. My mother stood up and greeted Adrian automatically. My father looked at me and asked what was happening. I pulled out a chair and said I wanted to introduce someone. I told my parents that Adrian was my boyfriend. My mother froze. My father froze too. Leo opened his eyes so wide that it was almost comical. My mother needed almost half a minute before she managed to ask whether he and Ryan were really together. Adrian said we had been dating for 1 year and 9 months. My father looked at me and asked whether that was true. Adrian answered before I could. He said he had pursued me. My mother sat down with a complicated expression. She asked whether Mrs. Shaw knew. She asked whether Adrian's family knew anything. I was about to speak, but Adrian said he was serious about me. My mother looked directly at him and said she was not asking whether he was serious. We were young. We might love each other deeply now, but the Shaw family was not an ordinary household. My mother told him that Ryan would be the person who faced pressure first. I told my parents that whatever came later, we would handle it ourselves. My father had remained quiet from the beginning. Finally, he told Adrian to stop being so formal and simply call him Uncle Michael. My father said he did not care which family Adrian came from. He only wanted one answer. If the Shaw family ever forced Adrian to choose between them and Ryan, what would he do? He said he would choose Ryan. My father kept watching him and said the answer came too quickly. Adrian said it was because he had thought about it for a long time. My father reminded him that we were only around 20. No one could guarantee what would happen in 5 years. Adrian said he was not asking my father to trust him immediately. He only wanted him to understand that nothing he said that night was casual. Then Leo tugged my mother's sleeve and asked whether he was allowed to call Adrian his brother-in-law now. Adrian said yes at the same time. Leo smiled brightly and called him brother-in-law. Adrian took a membership card from his pocket for a popular entertainment complex Leo had mentioned earlier at dinner. He said he would take Leo there next time. I asked when he had prepared it. He said he had just asked his assistant to arrange it. My father watched us and finally laughed in helpless disbelief. The tension in the room eased. My mother was still not completely reassured, but she did not object. After dinner, she pulled me aside and asked whether I was certain. She looked across the room where Adrian was speaking with my father. Then she told me that whatever happened later, I should never lower myself simply because I loved someone. I looked at Adrian and said I never had. My mother nodded. After my parents learned about us, Adrian became almost like a different person. Not in the way he treated me. His mood simply became so openly good that Kevin noticed immediately. At our next gathering, Kevin looked at Adrian once and asked what had happened. Adrian said he had met my parents. Kevin nearly sprayed water across the table. He asked whether my family had really let Adrian leave alive. Adrian asked why they would not. One person was missing from that gathering, Ethan. After he told me he had given up on Adrian, he appeared around Adrian much less often. My own relationship with Ethan actually became easier. We were not especially close, but we worked well together, and he never questioned me deeply about Adrian. That lasted until one media club meeting when Ethan received a call from home. After a few sentences, his expression became strange. He said his aunt was currently at the Shaw house. Ethan looked at me and said she seemed to be discussing Julian with Mrs. Shaw. I said Julian's interest in me had already ended, so it should not matter. Ethan frowned and asked whether I was not worried. That evening, Mrs. Hayes had dinner with the Shaw family. Adrian returned home while the meal was still happening, and Mrs. Shaw called him into the room to greet the guests. Ethan was also there. Mrs. Hayes was saying that Julian rarely liked anyone so seriously, and that it was unfortunate Ryan already had a boyfriend. Mrs. Shaw answered that young relationships did not always last forever. Adrian walked in at exactly that moment. His expression immediately cooled. Adrian responded politely, then asked what Mrs. Hayes thought of Julian. She said her nephew was naturally excellent. Adrian asked whether she thought Julian and Ryan were suitable. Mrs. Shaw looked at her son and asked why he cared about that question. Adrian sat down and said he was only curious. Ethan told me the entire scene the next day. He said he had been terrified Adrian would reveal everything on the spot. Ethan covered his face and said his aunt had interrupted before Adrian could answer. She joked that if Adrian cared so much about Ryan's love life, perhaps Ryan was actually Adrian's boyfriend. Ethan looked painfully apologetic and said he had wanted to disappear beneath the table. Mrs. Shaw had laughed at first. Mrs. Shaw asked whether it was true. Ethan continued anyway. Mrs. Shaw had not made a scene in front of guests. She simply told everyone to finish dinner. My phone vibrated while Ethan was still talking. Adrian's name appeared. He started to offer help. I told him it had nothing to do with him. Then I looked at him and added that this would have happened sooner or later. He should not blame himself. I walked toward him and asked whether Mrs. Shaw knew. I asked whether he had told her. He said Ethan had accidentally opened the subject first, and then Adrian confirmed it. Adrian looked at me and asked whether I blamed Ethan. After several seconds, Adrian said I needed to go home with him. He said yes. His mother wanted to see me. I breathed out and agreed. He said that if his mother said anything cruel, he would deal with it himself. Then he tightened his hand and told me not to leave alone. Mrs. Shaw sat in the living room when we arrived. No staff were present. My mother was not there either. Only the three of us remained. She looked at me for a long time before asking how long Adrian and I had been together. I said 1 year and 9 months. She asked whether it had begun during our final year of high school. I said yes after I turned 18. She looked at Adrian and asked whether he had pursued me. Adrian said Ryan had not wanted to speak yet, and he had agreed. Mrs. Shaw turned back to me and asked whether the reason was partly because my mother worked for the family. She asked what the other reason was. I told her I had not wanted our relationship to affect both families before Adrian and I were mature enough to handle the consequences. Mrs. Shaw leaned back and asked whether I believed we were mature enough now. Adrian quietly said my name, probably afraid I would say something that placed all the burden on myself. I looked at him, then back at his mother. Mrs. Shaw asked whether I understood the future position Adrian was being prepared for. She asked whether I understood the plans the family had already built around him. I said I knew some of them. Then she asked whether I truly believed the two of us were suitable. Adrian started to speak, but Mrs. Shaw told him the question was for me. Adrian said I was his boyfriend, so the question concerned him too. I told Mrs. Shaw I could not claim Adrian and I matched in every visible category. Our families were different, the worlds we had grown up in were different, and our likely careers would also be different. She asked why we were still together then. I said because none of those differences had made me stop loving him. Mrs. Shaw closed her eyes for several seconds. Then she told me to go home first. Adrian immediately said he would take me. I said I could return by myself. We stared at each other until he finally gave in and told me to call when I arrived. I left the main house. My mother was in the staff residence, but I did not go to her. I did not want her to learn everything that same night. He said he had left the house. I asked what Mrs. Shaw had said. Then he asked where I was. He said he had called and then he had come. It was already late, but he asked me to come downstairs for a while. Adrian stood beside the car. He looked more tired than usual. I asked whether his mother opposed us. I asked whether his grandfather knew. That was the real problem. Mrs. Shaw might object, but she could still be reasoned with. Adrian's grandfather was different. I asked what Adrian planned to do. He looked at me and said not break up. He said nothing else. That part was simple. The complicated part belonged to everyone around us. He took my hand and said his part contained only one decision. Neither of us said anything more. The late autumn night was cold, but our joined hands were warm. We did not know the real storm was only days away. My mother submitted her resignation before the relationship reached Adrian's grandfather. While folding clothes, she suddenly asked whether Mrs. Shaw knew about Adrian and me. I did not hide it. I said yes. She asked whether Mrs. Shaw objected. My mother's hands stopped. I quickly told her the resignation had nothing to do with us. She said exactly. She had submitted it before learning anything. She did not want me to think she had been forced to leave because of my relationship. I said he refused to break up. My mother asked what I thought. She sighed and told me that although she did not oppose us, she still needed to say something. Adrian was 20. Today he might be willing to fight his entire family for me. But what about 5 years later? What about 10? She said she was not accusing Adrian of lying. She only wanted me not to build my entire future on a promise made by another person while both of us were still very young. My mother looked surprised and asked why he had come. Adrian said he wanted to speak with her. He sat down and said he had heard my father wanted to open a restaurant. My mother immediately told him that our family could manage our own finances. Adrian said he had not come to give anyone money. He took out a folder. A friend of his had a commercial property with an old lease that still had 3 years remaining. Because the owner wanted to transfer it quickly, the rent was below market value. If my parents were interested, Adrian could simply introduce them. My mother looked at the information and asked whether he was trying to help because of me. Adrian said yes, but an introduction was only an introduction. My parents would make their own decision and spend their own money. My mother did not accept immediately. Adrian placed the folder on the table and said she could look at it. If it was not suitable, she could forget about it. I stood nearby and did not interfere. Finally, my mother picked up the folder and thanked him. Adrian said there was no need. The door opened. Mrs. Shaw stood outside with the housekeeper and 2 others behind her. She looked at Adrian, then at the small room. Her eyes moved to me. She said Adrian's grandfather was looking for him. Adrian stepped out and said he would go immediately. Then he said Ryan was coming too. My mother stood quickly and addressed Mrs. Shaw. Mrs. Shaw did not look at her. She only told me to follow. Adrian took my hand in front of everyone. Mrs. Shaw saw it and said nothing. Adrian's grandfather was waiting in the study. His father was there as well. The air felt cold enough to cut through skin. The old man looked at our joined hands and told Adrian to let go. His grandfather said his full name in warning. Adrian said that if his grandfather had something to say, he should simply say it. The old man asked whether Adrian had been taught to speak to elders that way. I tried to pull my hand back. Adrian held tighter. His grandfather looked at me and addressed me formally as Ryan Blake. I said 1 year and 9 months. He asked whether I understood my own position. Adrian immediately interrupted and said he had pursued me. I told the old man that I understood. He asked whether I understood and still chose to stay beside Adrian. I said Adrian and I loved each other. His grandfather gave a cold laugh and asked what 2 20-year-olds knew about love. Adrian answered that, at the very least, we knew who we wanted beside us. His father ordered him to be silent. I had never seen him confront his family so directly. He said the relationship was his decision and no one should interrogate Ryan for it. His grandfather stared at him and asked whether he planned to defy the entire Shaw family over a college romance. Adrian said that if no one tried to control his life, there would be no need to defy anyone. The old man said the Shaw family had raised him for 20 years only to hear that sentence. Mrs. Shaw finally said enough. She looked at me and told me to leave the room first. I told him I would wait outside. Only then did he release my hand. I stood outside. I could not hear every sentence, but several voices rose sharply. Almost half an hour later, something crashed. Adrian stood in front of the desk. One side of his lip was split. His father had probably hit him. I walked straight to him and said his name. He looked at me and said it was fine. His grandfather told me to take him outside and let him clear his head. Adrian gave a cold laugh and asked whether his grandfather truly believed Ryan would help force him into obedience. I caught Adrian's arm and told him to come with me. I looked directly at him and repeated that he was coming with me. I took him to the small medical room inside the villa and cleaned the cut on his lip. I asked whether it hurt. I told him not to push an argument until someone hit him again. He said if he did not push back, they would think they had the right to decide for him. I said he could resist without deliberately provoking everyone. He asked what I was afraid of then. I looked at the injury on his mouth and said I was afraid he would get hurt because of me. Adrian said it was not because of me. It was because of his own choice. He told me not to accept responsibility that did not belong to me. He told me to listen carefully. He was not breaking up with me. I said I had never said I wanted to break up. He said no one would be allowed to say it for us either. Then Adrian added, even if I went overseas. Adrian froze too. He had clearly said something by accident. Mrs. Shaw stood outside. My expression became cold. I asked what going overseas meant. She looked at both of us and explained that my university had a 2-year exchange program. My academic record qualified, and the university had recommended me. I had not applied yet. Mrs. Shaw said I should think about it before deciding. He said in the study a few minutes earlier. I asked why he had not told me. He said because he did not agree with the idea. Mrs. Shaw said it was genuinely an excellent academic opportunity. She said she did not hate me. I said I knew. Then she said Adrian and I needed distance to discover whether this relationship could actually survive time. Adrian stood and said there was no need for a test. Mrs. Shaw ordered him to be quiet. For the first time that evening, my mind felt completely clear. I asked Mrs. Shaw what would happen if I chose to go. Mrs. Shaw said no one would stop us from communicating. I understood the concession. His grandfather would have preferred complete separation. The moment we entered his bedroom, he closed the door and said I was not going. He said I was already thinking about accepting. I looked directly at him and explained that I had wanted to apply for that exact program the previous year. I said that just because his family was now using the opportunity as a method to separate us did not automatically make the opportunity bad. Adrian stared at me for a very long time. Then I said the most important part. Long distance did not mean breaking up. Adrian pulled me close until our foreheads touched. His voice became rough. He said I could go anywhere I wanted, but I could not leave him. I held the back of his neck and promised I would not. Outside that room, the Shaw family believed the exchange program would separate us. No one knew that the first decision Adrian and I made after the confrontation was to keep loving each other regardless of distance. The news spread quickly. Around university, people began saying Adrian and I had somehow fallen out because I was leaving. No one knew we had ever dated, so the rumor was almost amusing. They only said Ryan Blake would soon be gone, and Adrian Shaw would lose the close friend who had always been beside him. He came to see me before my flight and asked whether I was truly all right. I said at home. After the family conflict, Adrian's grandfather had restricted almost all of his financial freedom. Adrian was not locked inside the house, but his passport was taken, his company work was monitored, and every measure was designed to stop him from following me. He said that if he had not spoken carelessly that night, maybe the family would not have discovered us so soon. I closed my suitcase and told him this had always been going to happen. He sat quietly and asked whether I truly planned to maintain a long-distance relationship. I said yes. If the Shaw family never accepted us, we could simply wait until the day they no longer had the power to decide our lives. Ethan laughed and said I was starting to sound like Adrian. I said being around someone too long could be contagious. Ethan nodded. Before leaving, he told me that if I ever needed help, I could ask him. I checked the time. 10 hours remained before my flight. I did not call him. I was not angry. I simply knew he was searching for a way. Sure enough, close to midnight, the doorbell of my temporary apartment rang. Adrian stood outside. His coat was not fully fastened, His breathing was heavy, and the old injury on his mouth had still not completely healed. I asked how he had gotten out. He said Kevin had helped. His grandfather could punish him the next day. Almost a full minute passed before he asked what time my flight left. He said he would take me. I told him that if he appeared at the airport, his family would probably drag him home before I even reached security. There was no reason to make things worse. I pulled him down to sit and told him to listen. He said he did not want to. He told me he hated the next morning. He told me not to go. He told me not to say that. I almost laughed and pointed out that he finally understood how terrible those words sounded. On the third day after I arrived overseas, Adrian had class. I told him to go. He looked at me as if he did not understand. On the fourth day, he had a company meeting. I told him to attend it. He asked whether I was really instructing him to live normally after I left. He said he would not feel normal. I told him he had to continue anyway. He could not skip school, destroy his work, or deliberately make himself miserable to prove he loved me. Then he asked about me. He told me not to stay awake all night. Then he told me not to go to bars with strangers. I asked what that had to do with anything. I interrupted and reminded him this was a long-distance relationship, not a prison contract. Adrian finally laughed a little. The smile was short. He took my hand and said I would go to a new place, meet new people, and build a life where he was not physically present. I told him he would still be part of it. If we had to use the phone, we would use the phone. If the time difference was difficult, we would calculate it. If we could not hug, we would endure it. If we could not kiss, we would endure that too. Adrian said I made it sound easy. I told him it was not easy for me either. He asked whether I wanted him to cry so I could see proof. I said I was not going to cry either. Close to 2 in the morning, he said he wanted 1 year. He said 1 year to take back the right to control his own life. He said that did not mean he was powerless. I told him he did not need to hurry. He lowered his head and said he never wanted the next time he saw me to depend on someone else's permission. That was Adrian's road to walk, just as leaving the country was mine. There was no dramatic airport goodbye. No one ran through a terminal. Adrian had been discovered outside the house the previous night, so he could not come. We video called before the plane took off. He only told me to message him after landing. I told him to sleep that night. I told him not to cause trouble. He said he could not guarantee that. I said his name in warning. He told me to call after landing. Then he said he loved me, so I added that I loved him too. The plane left the runway. Riverton became smaller beyond the window. At the time, everyone believed distance would slowly weaken us. 3 days later, the doorbell of my overseas apartment rang. I had been eating while reading when I opened the door. A person who was supposed to be thousands of kilometers away stood outside. Adrian held a suitcase in his left hand. He looked exhausted after the long flight. I asked whether Kevin had somehow helped him recover his passport. I reminded him he had class the next day. He said he had taken 2 days off. I said his grandfather was probably furious. Adrian stepped inside and closed the door. He asked me not to start scolding him immediately because he had just spent almost 10 hours traveling. I said he had chosen to travel those 10 hours by himself. Then he looked directly at me and said he had only come to confirm one thing. He asked whether I truly was not breaking up with him. I reminded him that I had already said it. Adrian said he wanted to hear it in person. So I told him again. We were not breaking up. He asked even if 5 years passed. I said I thought the program was 2 years. Adrian breathed out as if he had not truly breathed for 3 days. I pulled his suitcase inside and asked how long he could stay. I asked whether he had really flown 10 hours for only 2 days. Outside the window was a city I barely knew. Inside the small apartment there were only 2 of us. No parents, no Shaw family, no rumors. Adrian spoke beside my ear. From then on, other people could believe we had broken up if they wanted. He said it would create less trouble. I understood. He wanted to reverse the secret. He said we did not need to lie. We simply did not need to explain ourselves to anyone. That became our second secret. The first secret was that we loved each other. 5 years later, I returned to Riverton. My plane landed close to 4 in the afternoon. The city had changed. A new train line ran directly from the airport into the center. Several buildings had appeared around the university district. Only a few people still felt exactly the same. He was 23 now. The look of a first-year student had disappeared. His shirt was neat, his trousers were tailored, and his hair was cut shorter. The moment he saw me, he raised one hand in greeting. I pulled my suitcase toward him and asked whether he was really that free. He said even if he was not free, he had to come. He said he was still paying for the mistake he made years ago. I reminded him that I had told him many times it was not his fault. He took my suitcase and said he still felt guilty. Then he asked whether I knew there would be a welcome dinner that night. Ethan looked at me and said I was strangely calm about seeing an old boyfriend after 5 years. I glanced at him and asked why he believed the phrase old boyfriend. He said everyone outside called Adrian that. During those 5 years, Adrian and I had not met often, but we had never truly been apart. During the first year, he flew to see me 4 times. During the second year, I returned to Riverton for 2 short visits. During the third year, Adrian finally gained enough company shares and voting power that the Shaw family could no longer control his decisions. At the end of that year, we registered our marriage in a place where the law allowed us to do so. There was no wedding. There was no public announcement. Only Adrian, me, and 2 friends as witnesses. I continued my academic program and later accepted work overseas for another 2 years. We lived like a married couple in a long-distance relationship. The only unusual part was that almost no one knew we were married. Mrs. Shaw learned during the 4th year. Adrian's grandfather still refused to speak my name, but he no longer had the authority to make Adrian leave me. Ethan pulled my suitcase beside him and asked whether I had heard the recent rumor about a marriage connection between the Shaw and Hayes families. He looked at me and asked whether I did not want to know who the supposed pair was. Ethan said people were claiming he was the one being matched. I told him I already knew that was false. He asked how I could be so certain. I said because I knew who he was actually preparing to marry. He asked whether Adrian had told me. The person Ethan was preparing to marry was Victor Shaw, a distant cousin of Adrian. The Shaw and Hayes families really were going to be connected by marriage. The rumor simply had the wrong people. The welcome dinner that evening was held at the restaurant my parents owned. Years earlier, my father had opened the first location in the property Adrian introduced to my mother. My father ran the business himself. Over time, he opened additional branches. No one owed anyone. Adrian had only offered one useful opportunity at the right moment. I changed into a dark suit and arrived at 7. A lot of old friends were already there. Kevin saw me and immediately put an arm around my shoulders. He said I had finally decided to come home. I reminded him I returned every year. He said I always returned secretly. I said I came to see my family. Kevin added that someone else also used to travel secretly after me. He smiled and said nothing more. 5 years had changed him more visibly than it changed me. The lines of the 20-year-old student were gone. His shoulders were broader. His dark suit fit perfectly, and his entire presence had become quieter and heavier. People approached him the moment he entered. Kevin made an appreciative sound and said Adrian had become a good actor. I told him I was not acting. Kevin said we were looking at each other like strangers. Mrs. Shaw had just entered behind Adrian. I greeted her as Mrs. Shaw. I understood immediately and changed the greeting. I called her Mom. Mrs. Shaw looked much more satisfied. She asked when I planned to come to the family house for dinner now that I had returned. She looked across the room at her son and commented that he knew everything but still pretended otherwise. The woman who had once opposed us most strongly now seemed irritated that her married son and son-in-law were not standing beside each other. Ethan arrived late. At one point, he pulled me onto the balcony to speak privately. He said he still wanted to apologize. I told him again that I genuinely did not blame him. He began talking about what might have happened if he had not spoken that night. He said sometimes the person who left seemed freer than the person who stayed. I looked at him and asked whether he meant his own upcoming marriage. He said he did not dislike Victor. The problem was simply that both families talked too much and decided too much. I told him to speak directly with Victor. I thought Victor would listen. I reminded him that Victor Shaw was not Adrian, but he was not a machine built by the family either. Adrian looked at Ethan and said Victor was looking for him. Ethan immediately understood and said he would go. He asked how much I had drunk. Then he asked which hotel I was staying in. I told him I was not going to a hotel that night. I said at someone else's home. I said that after more than 4 months without seeing each other in person, this was apparently the first thing he wanted to argue about. He asked whose home. I said yes. I turned back toward the party and said the dinner was not finished. Adrian caught my wrist and asked for the address. I asked what he planned to do with it. He said he had not been drinking and there was a driver anyway. The tone was exactly the same as when he was 20. Adrian's expression became stranger when he read it, but he said nothing. After the dinner, he really did take me there. When we reached the apartment building, Adrian got out too. I told him he did not need to follow me upstairs because someone else was waiting. Adrian watched my hand and asked whether I knew the password to another man's home. The apartment was dark. I turned on the light. It was our marriage registration photograph. He closed the door and said very good. Adrian caught my waist and pulled me back against him. He said my full name in warning. Then I reminded him that this was also my home. My name was on the ownership papers too. He asked whether I had deliberately made him jealous. I told him he had managed that without my help. Adrian said after 5 years I still used the same kind of trick. He lowered his head and kissed me. It was our first kiss after more than 4 months without meeting. It was not rushed, but it lasted long enough that when we separated, his hand remained at the back of my neck. He asked whether I had returned permanently. I said yes. I was not leaving again. My work transfer had been approved. Adrian stared at me for a long time and asked why I had not told him before. I said I wanted to tell him in person. Adrian gestured around the apartment and said the decision was already made because I had a home there. I reminded him I also had my parents' home. He said I was married, so living with my husband made more sense. I said the marriage certificate contained 2 names but no assigned roles. I said there was nothing to negotiate. Over 5 years, his cold public image had grown even stronger. In front of me, he had barely changed. I went to get water. Adrian wrapped his arms around me from behind and said my name. He said, "Welcome home." Those 2 words were lighter than any grand promise. Yet they made the entire 5-year journey feel as if it finally had an ending. I turned around and said his name. I said I was home. News of my return spread quickly through our social circle. Another rumor spread even faster. Adrian Shaw and Ryan Blake seemed to be spending time together again. The family dinner at the Shaw estate that weekend was the first time I entered the villa with no need to hide what I was. My mother had left the estate 5 years earlier. The old staff residence had been renovated into employee restrooms. The room where I once lived no longer existed in the same form. Adrian came over and asked whether I wanted to go inside. I said no, I was only remembering. He said his old room upstairs was still nearly the same. I told him that room had little to do with me. He said I had probably spent more time there than he had during some years. I told him not to say things like that inside his family home. Then he added that it was my family home now too. Dinner included Adrian's parents, Mrs. Shaw, his grandfather, and several relatives. His grandfather looked much older. Most of his hair had turned white. When he saw me, he only looked. He did not greet me. Mrs. Shaw noticed the simple ring on my left hand and said I had finally decided to wear it outside. I told her I had always worn it. I had only removed it during my first few days back because I wanted the family to know before the wider social circle did. Adrian immediately said he had told me there was no need to remove it. Mrs. Shaw looked at her son and said she had been speaking to Ryan. I pushed a glass of water toward him and told him to drink. Mrs. Shaw watched the exchange with an expression that reminded me of Ethan years earlier. Perhaps she finally understood why outsiders had always thought our relationship was strange. Dinner remained ordinary for most of the evening. No one mentioned the old conflict. Near the end, Adrian's grandfather suddenly asked when we had registered the marriage. I answered that it had been 2 years earlier, overseas. He asked whether we had informed the family. Adrian began to speak, but I caught his hand under the table. The old man looked at me and said I was still similar to the person I had been before. He placed his chopsticks down and said that in the past, I had at least known fear. He asked whether I was no longer afraid of that. I said now I had enough ability to carry the consequences that actually belonged to me. The table stayed silent for a few seconds. I did not look at him, but I squeezed back. After dinner, Mrs. Shaw asked me to remain for a moment. Then she smiled and commented that I still spoke very little. I said saying less was useful when I had nothing important to add. She said Adrian had plenty to say whenever I was around. I told her he only behaved that way in private. Mrs. Shaw looked toward the garden for a while. Then she admitted that years earlier, she had genuinely believed distance would make us realize we were only experiencing youthful attachment. She told me that 3 days after I left the country, Adrian had flown after me. Then she asked whether I knew that his grandfather had frozen his cards. So Adrian sold the car he loved most. I was genuinely surprised. Adrian had never told me. Mrs. Shaw explained that, during the first period of conflict, he needed his own cash to travel. When he returned, he started working from a much lower position in the company because his grandfather refused to give him authority. Mrs. Shaw said that sometimes she had asked whether everything he was doing was worth it. Mrs. Shaw added that my years overseas had not been easy either. I asked what Adrian had told her. She said he had mentioned that I studied while working, and that I later turned down a better position abroad in order to return to Rivorton. I corrected her. I had not returned only for Adrian. I wanted to be closer to my parents as well. Mrs. Shaw nodded and said that was healthier. It was probably the first conversation we had ever had simply as members of the same family. Not employer and employee's son. Not the mother of a wealthy heir and the unsuitable boyfriend. Just two people who both cared about the same man. Before I left, she said there would be a larger family gathering at the end of the month. I could attend with Adrian, and I did not need to hide the ring. I smiled slightly and said I was not planning to hide it anymore. The final secret became public at that family gathering. There was no formal announcement, no microphone, and no prepared speech. A relative simply noticed that Adrian and I wore matching rings and asked about them. Adrian answered calmly that they were wedding rings. The relative stared as if he had heard incorrectly. Adrian added that we had been legally married for 2 years. I told Adrian that he truly did not know how to reveal information gently. The relative looked at me and repeated my name in disbelief. Ethan sat several seats away and covered his forehead. Victor, beside him, asked whether he had known. Ethan said he knew we loved each other, but not that we had already married. Kevin laughed until an older relative told him to control himself. Mrs. Shaw was the calmest person at the table. She said the marriage was legal and asked what everyone found so surprising. That single sentence closed the discussion more effectively than anything else. The news spread beyond the family gathering. People who had once said Adrian and I could never be together suddenly discovered that we had already been married for 2 years. For us, nothing had changed. The final secret simply no longer needed protection. Ethan and Victor held their wedding before we held ours. Their ceremony took place at the beginning of spring. Before it started, Ethan pulled me aside and said there was something he still found strange. He said that when he was 18, he had liked Adrian. Then he discovered Adrian was my boyfriend. Now he was marrying one of Adrian's relatives. I said life had taken him in a wide circle. Ethan laughed and said he was fortunate he had stopped pursuing Adrian early. I said continuing would not have changed the result. Ethan put a hand over his chest and said I was still brutally direct. He looked toward Victor and asked whether I thought their marriage would be good. Ethan complained that I could at least offer comfort. I said the person who understood the quality of his marriage best would be him. He became quiet, then smiled and said he thought it would be good. I said then that was enough. He asked what I thought about Adrian and me. I said I also thought we were good. Ethan repeated the word good and said I could have chosen something more dramatic. He said if Adrian heard that answer, he would probably demand a better one. He asked whether Ethan was finished talking to me. Ethan complained that he was about to get married and Adrian was still guarding me from him. Adrian said he had only looked because Ryan was standing beside Ethan. Ethan gave up and told him to take his person away. Adrian naturally caught my wrist and told me we needed to go. I told him to go without me. He said I was coming too because we were family. He thanked me for not hating him years earlier. I asked what reason I could possibly have had to hate him. Ethan said because he had pursued my husband. Adrian answered before I could and said the apology was several years late. I pulled Adrian away and told him not to provoke the groom on his wedding day. Adrian still looked dissatisfied. He said he had never forgotten that I once called Ethan a good person. I stared at him and reminded him how many years had passed. He said he remembered things connected to me very well. I told him he was excellent at remembering useless information. He said if it was connected to me, it was not useless. Our own wedding took place half a year later. It was not large. Our parents, a few relatives, and close friends attended. Adrian's grandfather never said whether he would come. When the ceremony was about to begin, his seat was still empty. Before I entered the small hall, my mother adjusted the collar of my suit and asked whether I was nervous. She said I had not seemed nervous when I registered the marriage. I said that had only required signing papers. This time, many people were watching. My father stood nearby and joked that I still had time to run. My mother lightly hit his arm and asked what kind of thing he was saying on his son's wedding day. My father said he was offering one final chance. My father nodded and told me to go. Adrian walked toward me by himself. Kevin served as the ceremony host. He had clearly prepared a long list of jokes, but one look from Adrian caused him to remove several. When it was time to exchange rings, Adrian commented that our old rings still fit and that I had been the one who insisted on buying new ones. I told him a wedding should have wedding rings. I told him it was not wasteful if he wore one and I wore the other. Kevin asked whether we wanted to say anything. He remained silent for several seconds. I expected a long speech. In the end, he only said my name and thanked me for coming home. 5 years of distance, thousands of calls, long flights, arguments caused by time zones, and days when we were both so busy that only one message could be exchanged. All of it became one sentence. Thank you for coming home. I looked at him and thanked him for still being there. Kevin immediately complained that we had said too little. Adrian's grandfather. No one called attention to him. No one ran toward him. Adrian only looked for 1 second, but the hand holding mine tightened slightly. We did not need a dramatic reconciliation. Some relationships require more time than love does. We had already waited 5 years. We could wait longer. After the wedding, we did not return to the Shaw estate and we did not stay in a hotel. Adrian drove us back to that apartment. The moment I entered, I noticed an old box on the table. He said it contained my things and told me to open it. Inside were my old student identification card, used plane tickets, several photographs, and a bracelet I had lost during my first year at university. I asked why the bracelet had been with him. I asked why he had never returned it. He said 5 years. Then I said his full name. At the bottom was the plane ticket from the trip he made 3 days after I moved overseas. The date was still clear. I told him his mother had explained everything. He said it was not exactly like that. His cards had been frozen and he needed cash. The car was simply the easiest thing to sell. I reminded him it had been his favorite car. He said it was not important at that moment. I put the ticket down and told him I hated when he did too much and said nothing. Adrian said those had been his decisions. I said I still had the right to know. Then he pulled me closer and said my name. He told me not to turn love into an account book. I said I was not doing that. He said neither of us owed the other anything. He had gone after me because he wanted to. I had returned because I wanted to. He said that was enough. There was no need to calculate who loved more, who sacrificed more, or who had waited longer. We had simply moved through each stage by making our own choices. Sometimes we walked the same road. Sometimes thousands of kilometers separated us. We had never truly let go. I closed the old box and told him to put it away. I said where it had always been. He asked whether we should move it to our new house. I said this apartment was also our home. Outside the window, Riverton was bright with evening lights. From that high floor, part of the university campus could still be seen in the distance. Where Ethan once ran toward Adrian and asked whether he remembered him. Where people once assumed the heir of the Shaw family would eventually choose someone with the correct family background. Adrian came over and asked what I was looking at. He asked whether I wanted to visit the next day. He asked whether we should walk there. I asked whether the old restaurant near campus was still open. He said it was and that he sometimes went there. I looked at him and asked whether he went alone. He asked whether I was finally jealous. He said that after all these years, I had finally asked who he spent time with. I told him not to become too pleased with himself. Adrian pulled me away from the window and asked what actually mattered then. He was more than 25 now. Outside that apartment, one look from him could silence an entire meeting room. At home, he could still become delighted because I asked one meaningless question. Adrian said my full name. He reminded me it was our wedding day. I stood still for 2 seconds, then told him fine. It was rare for him to obey so quickly. I had only walked a few steps when he called after me and said I was not allowed to sleep in the guest room that night. I told him the warning was pointless then. Our home was not large. 2 men living together was not especially dramatic. His shirts ended up beside my jackets. 2 pairs of shoes sat near the entrance. 2 cups remained on the table. 2 matching rings caught the same light. I once believed the difference between Adrian and me was something I would have to fear forever. Later, I understood that the difference was real, but it was not the only thing that decided where 2 people would go. Adrian never pulled me upward into his world. We both walked until we found a place somewhere in the middle. There was no young master of the Shaw family there. There was no son of a household employee. There was only Adrian Shaw and Ryan Blake. He said my phone was ringing. He said both mothers were on the same video call. I walked out. Adrian held the phone with a helpless expression. The screen showed my mother and Mrs. Shaw sitting together. My mother immediately asked whether we had arrived home safely. Mrs. Shaw asked whether we were coming to the family house for dinner the next day. Adrian said we planned to visit the university first. My mother laughed and said Ryan had already agreed, so Adrian should stop arguing. Adrian looked at me and said he was not arguing. Mrs. Shaw said that from childhood until adulthood, Adrian had always listened to Ryan more than anyone else. He said that was a good thing. I reached for the phone and told both mothers to stop teasing. Adrian stood beside me and said his mother had been right. I told him not all the time. He said most of the time it was voluntary. He placed the phone down and repeated that it was voluntary. I looked at him and did not answer the overly sentimental line. Adrian took my hand. The new rings on our fingers touched lightly. Inside our home, there was no secret left to hide. That was enough. Thank you for listening to this story on BL Storytime. If you enjoyed Ryan and Adrian's journey, please support BL Storytime and come back for the next story.